Okay, now that we've got everything kind of set up, let's go ahead and make our script that is going to control how the weapon operates. So I'm going to go to Add Component, and I'm actually going to go to New Script. And this is with my rocket launcher selected. My new script is going to be called Weapon. And then I'm just going to double-click on that. And it's actually going to open up Visual Studio. But before I do that, I'm going to actually take the weapon and I'm going to move it into my scripts folder, my weapon scripts folder. Now there's a few things that I need to do. The first thing that I want to do here, oh, looks like I got to reopen that. Let's see. Okay, there we go. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is I want to get a reference to the animator controller. I want to make a slot that is a reference to the rigid body that I'm going to launch as a rocket, and I need to use the transform of the end of the barrel to tell me where I want this to actually fire. So I'm going to make a public rigid body, and that is going to be called Projectile. And then I'm going to make another public transform, which is fire point. Now, I want to get the reference to the animator, but what I'm going to do with that one is I'm going to call it a private variable, and I'm going to make that an animator. And then I'm just going to call that animator in lowercase. And so then we have our start and our update. And we're going to use both of these because we want to set it up really simply. But in my start, all I really need to do is make my animator equal, and I'm going to do get component in children animator. And that should give me a reference to the animator that is on this game object. Now, we could have just done animator get component, but I often find that I put scripts like this on objects that might have an animator nested within them. So just be aware that if you have multiple animators on multiple children, you might actually only want to do get component. But so that way, I will be able to set my animator to function. And then we can go into our update. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a small if statement. So if, and it's going to say input dot get button down. And we're going to go with fire 1. And then we need to close the parentheses. So it's if, in parentheses, input get button down, fire, in parentheses. And then I'm going to make a set of braces. And then we're going to do a rigid body. We're creating a new rigid body called Projectile. Actually, let me say, make sure that it's capital R for rigid body. And this is going to be called Projectile instance. And projectile instance, then we want to use that. And projectile instance equals instantiate. And we're going to call this projectile. So that's the variable we made earlier, which is what actually will spawn. And then the next thing is we tell it where to spawn from. And we're going to call that fire point dot position. And then comma. the next one is the rotation. So we're going to call it fire point dot rotation. And then just outside of those parentheses, I want it to say as rigid body. And that just means that we're going to actually instantiate that object as a rigid body. So and the reason we're doing that is because we know that we want to actually add some code that tells it to do something based on the fact that it is a rigid body. Now, you don't necessarily have to do this. You could make it that it just spawns a game object, and then you could put like the momentum code into the game object itself, so you wouldn't necessarily have to do this momentum. But so to add momentum, we actually want to add one more public variable. So I'm going to go to public float, and I'm going to call this force. And then we're going to use that variable to control how the force gets added to the rocket instance. So, I'm sorry, the projectile instance. So now we're going to do projectile instance dot add force, create parentheses, and it's going to be fire point dot forward times, so the kind of asterisk symbol, and then that's going to be force, which is the variable that we created up there at the top. And then I'm just going to end that line with a semicolon. Now, we've got this projectile thing happening here, but we don't necessarily have the animator doing what it needs to do, and we also don't have a force value for this. So now this would give us a force of 0 if we just went like this, but I can actually say public float force equals, and then I could say like 5,000 or something like that, and that'll be the default. Maybe we wouldn't want to do 5,000, but maybe we could be like 2,000 or something, and then we could change it on the fly. But now we want to add one more line here, and I'm just going to like drop down a couple lines below this whole rigid body instantiation thing. And then what I'm going to do is I just want to do animator dot set trigger, and then create parentheses, and then I'm going to type in the name fire, which is actually the one that we set up before for the trigger. So I'm going to go ahead and save weapon.cs. And then we'll jump back in and make sure that we haven't overlooked anything. Okay. Inconsistent line endings. That's not too bad. Okay, so then if we click on our rocket launcher, what we're going to notice is we have a projectile, a fire point, and a force variable for this. And then we also have our controller, which has this fire, which is the name of the trigger, and we should be able to plug these things in properly, and then this will actually fire correctly. So the first thing we need to do is we need to actually have a projectile prefab that we're going to use. So we have our projectile, which is just our rocket projectile in this case. And so I just drag that out into the scene. And this is going to be a tricky thing because if you're not super familiar with doing this, you want to make sure that almost everything that you use in a game is a prefab and not a model. So one way that you can tell if you're working with a model file versus a prefab is that the model will say select, revert, and open. Whereas if you look at a prefab, it says select, revert, and apply. Now a model can never have anything change about it without being a prefab first. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a rigid body. So effects rigid body. So we have this. We can select this to use gravity or not. For now, let's actually turn off use gravity. Collision detection. I'm going to turn this to continuous dynamic because we're going to need to make sure that we're tracking collision really well. And then we have our constraints. We don't need to worry about any of that. So, okay. So now there's a few things that we want to take a look at. First of all, we need to make sure that this is actually a prefab. So I'm going to go down to the weapon folder. I'm going to right-click. I'm going to create a new folder. I'm going to call it prefabs. Go into that one. I'm going to grab my rocket projectile, and I'm going to slide it over here. And because I dragged it back in to the project, it now is a prefab. And you'll notice it says select, revert, and apply. So that will be something now, because it has a rigid body on it, that we can actually use in this rocket launcher script. So I'm going to drag that rocket projectile into that projectile. And then in my determine my fire point, I want to actually take a look at this. And so, like, one thing, and this is actually a mistake that I made, so I want you guys to be aware of it, but my fire point actually is facing the wrong direction. It's not, its forward direction would actually be out to the side. So this is actually fairly correctable. All I have to do is I'm going to, with the fire point selected, I'm going to create an empty prefab, which will make a game object. And I'm going to call this final fire point. And I'm actually just going to rotate it while holding down the control key so that it gets 90 degrees and is facing the right direction. And then in the rocket, I can change that fire point by just dragging the fire point out there. So let's go ahead and apply our first-person controller. And then let's take a look at what this does. Okay, so what you'll notice here is now it's firing that rocket every time I press this. But there's a couple of problems, right? So first of all, it looks like that animation is playing a bit inconsistently. So it actually kind of looks like it has a bit of a delayed reaction. There can be a few reasons for that. One of them being we might want to make sure that none of these animations require that the transition's complete. So, for example, each of these are listed as has exit time. I could turn off the has exit time for the previous animation. And let's see what would happen if we update that. Okay. So that functions a little bit better. Still not perfect. I think we could improve it. But let's take a look at that. So so we have fixed duration. We can actually turn off fixed duration, and then let's see what happens there. If we turn off fixed duration, okay. So it doesn't do exactly what we want. So we can have interruptions. So we could say, like, what happens if we say interruption source, if we allow current state to interrupt. Okay, so I mean, there's a few ways we can improve this, but since this is kind of a basic overview, let's not worry too much about like really polishing it insanely, because like what you'd probably want to do is you'd want to set up like a fire delay of how long it would take before you can fire again. But that's something that's a little bit beyond the scope of this discussion, because I just want you to get something working. Now, the other thing that we haven't done here yet is I want to do an instantiation of our particle effect. So the particle will actually, I'm going to call this public game object, and I'm going to call this fire particle. And I'm going to save that. And then what I can do is I can go into my rocket launcher, and under the fire particle, I can plug in, I'm going to call this the weapon flare. And then we just need to make sure that we actually instantiate it. So right around, I'm just going to go, and I'm going to do one line down. Since all of these things are basically happening at the same time, I'm going to go and take my make a new rigid body. I'm actually not a new rigid body. I don't want to do a new rigid body because this is a game object. So I'm going to do a new game object. Fire particle instance. And then I'm going to do a fire particle instance equals instantiate, and it's going to instantiate in parentheses fire particle fire point dot position, and then the fire point dot rotation. And I will just say as game object, which you're actually going to have to do. And I don't need to add any force to it, so let's just see if that works. So I'll go ahead and play. Okay. All right, so now we get this particle effect to work. Now, that's working pretty okay, but there is one thing that we notice is a little bit of a problem with this, which is that they actually stay alive forever. Like, you'll see these here. And no matter what you do here, you'll keep mounting new instances of particles, and it'll become pretty unwieldy pretty soon. So fortunately, Unity creates plenty of ways that we can easily address the idea that the particles keep spawning forever. And one way that I think that we can go ahead and address that is we can just add one more line here, which is game object dot, sorry, that needs to be a capital letter, game object dot destroy. And what we want to do is we want to call it the fire particle instance, and then we want to give it a certain amount of time delay to tell it how long that it will wait to destroy it. So there's a few ways we can handle that, but I think that for now, let's just put 3 as an explicit time of, like, after 3 seconds it will destroy it. So let's take a look at how that varies. So if I go ahead and I spawn these particles, we've got all this stuff going on. Okay, you'll notice that now they're destroying after every few seconds. Okay. So that's pretty cool. But we're not quite done yet. So there's a couple ways we can handle making something play sound effects. I'm going to show you a really easy way. This isn't necessarily always the way that you're going to want to do it. But what we can do is we can actually take the weapon flare effect, which is the effect that plays whenever the weapon fires. And I can actually apply a sound effect to this that plays automatically. So if I go to the components, I go to audio source, then I'm going to have the ability to plug in an audio clip here, and I can plug in a rocket fire. And then I can set this to play on awake. And then really, pretty much. I just want to change the spatial blend to probably 3D. And then I just want to change the logarithmic roll-off to a linear roll-off. And then I'm going to apply that. And I also want to make sure that I've zeroed out the transformations on all of this, and then I'm going to apply that. And then I can delete it from the scene. So then if you make sure you have your sound turned on, because I didn't there for a second, then every time you fire, you create a new particle effect, it's going to actually make that sound. Okay, so then the last bit, and this is the last bit that we're going to work on, we're just going to make a simple script on the rocket projectile itself that tells the rocket to explode when it hits a surface. And for now, that's not going to have a whole lot of gameplay implication. It's just going to create the explosion particle. So let's make sure that we've got everything in order. So one of them, the first things we can do is under particle systems, we can make sure that we've added an audio source. And we can do this in the project here too. So I'm going to audio source. And then for the audio clip, I can just make sure I have that explosion. Make sure instead of logarithmic, I'm setting it to linear. Volume is fine. Spatial blend is 3D. And then just to check that out, I'm going to drag one into the scene really quick. Okay, so then that explodes appropriately. And then what we're going to do is on that projectile, I'm going to go to prefabs, rocket projectile. I'm going to add component, new script, projectile. And then I'm going to double click that. Then I've got my projectile here. Now, in this case, I mean, there's a lot of things that I could do with this. But what I really want to do is I'm going to, on collision enter, so we're going to make a new void on collision enter, parentheses, brackets. And then we're going to want to instantiate a prefab in the same way that we did before, and then we want to destroy this object. So what we're going to do is we need to make a public game object. And I'm going to call this impact particle. And then what we're going to do is I actually, in this case, am not going to track anything about that impact particle. I'm in fact just going to instantiate it. So I'm going to go to instantiate by itself. I don't need to make a variable for it because I'm not storing that anywhere. And I'm going to instantiate impact particle. And then I'm going to do game object dot position. I'm sorry, game object dot transform dot position. And then I'm going to do game object dot transform dot rotation. And actually, just to let you know, what this means, game object dot transform dot position, is that it's going to pick the actual owner of this script for that transform. And we actually don't even need to put game object there. We can just do transform dot position, transform dot rotation. And then the last thing I'm going to do is GameObject.destroy, and for that destroy, I'm going to call it this dot GameObject. And that's just explicitly confirming that it's this GameObject. You could just put GameObject. So what I'll see here is this projectile has this impact particle. And then we have the impact particle there, the slot for that projectile. I can go and find the particle system, and I can grab the explosion. And then I can go ahead and see what that does. So oh, looks like we've got a little bit of a problem here. It's actually not doing anything that when it hits objects, and that's actually really simple. It's because there's no collisions. So I need to go and add a collider to this. And I think in this case, I could use a capsule collider well enough if I drag out my rocket into the scene so that I can see what that capsule collider would look like. You see it looks kind of like a circle right now, but that's not really what I want. So I'm going to reduce the radius. I'm going to change the height. And I'm actually going to change which direction it is. So in this case, it will be the z-axis. And then I can adjust the height so that it fully encompasses the shape of the object, and then I can tweak the radius a little bit too for that purpose. And then I can apply this, and then we'll see what happens. Well, that's pretty cool. It actually doesn't work too badly. Now, there's only one thing that we need to keep an eye out for with this one, which is that we've got these particles spawning. And obviously, if we spawn a lot of them, there's actually a little bit of a problem with that in the same way that there was with the previous one. But because we destroy the projectile right upon impact, the projectile can't store information about that particle and make it die later. So I'm just going to make a really small script for this. So I'm going to write another script here. Now we got to make sure we're organizing things. So that projectile script, we need to put that in the scripts folder. And I'm going to call this, I'm going to make a new script. This time I'm just going to create it here. C# script, and I call this destroy timer. I'm going to enter that. And then I'm going to remove the update function. So we just have the start. And inside the start function, I'm going to do a game object. And in fact, we don't even have to do game object. We can just do destroy. And inside that, we can do either this dot game object, or we can just do game object. And then we can just say how long we want it to destroy. Now, because we're making a script that literally just does this, we want to make it as extensible as possible. So I'm going to create a public float, and I'm going to call this destroy timer equals, let's say, I'm going to call it 5. And then instead of typing in 5 here, I'm going to type in destroy timer. And there we go. I'm going to go ahead and save that. So now that we've written that script, all I have to do is go into my weapon explosion. I'm going to add component, go to scripts. I'm going to select my destroy timer, and then it should work. There we go. Okay, so one last thing that we might want to do, which I think would be kind of cool, is we might want to make it so that we can set some physics forces to apply for when this particle effect of the explosion happens. So I'm going to create one small script that will do that. So I'm going to create a new C# script, and I'm going to call this explosion. I'm going to double click that, bring it up into, yes, okay. Double click that script, open it up in Visual Studio. Okay, and so what we're going to do is we're going to set up two really simple things to get this to work. So I'm going to set up a public float, and I'm going to call this radius. We're going to use 5. And I'm going to call a public float power. Make that 10. I put F to make sure that it's it knows that it's a float. I'm going to use the start function and not the update function. So I'm just going to get rid of the update function. So then in the start function, I'm going to do a list of colliders. So I'm going to select a capital C collider, and I'm going to add 2 brackets, and then I'm going to call this colliders. And I'm going to get those colliders, I'm going to do a physics dot overlap sphere, and this is going to be transform dot position, and then the float radius is just going to be the radius that we created here. Oops, a little typo there. Okay. And what does this physics.overlap sphere just means that it's going to look for everything that's within this radius that we defined here, based on the transform.position, which is the start position, which is actually just the position of the object that has the explosion on it. And then I'm going to do a for each collider, oops, typos, collider for each collider hit in colliders, which is the variable that I just created. I'm going to do braces, go down one line. I'm going to do a rigid body, RB, so we're calling our rigid body RB, equals hit dot get component rigid body. And then the last thing that we'll do is that'll give us a list of rigid bodies in all of the colliders. So then what we're just going to do is say if RB is not equal to null, then we'll just, and I don't even need to do braces for this because it's just one thing. It's RB dot add explosion force. I'm going to use power. Transform dot position. So power is the magnitude of the explosion. Transform dot position, that's the location it is going to come from. Then we're going to use radius to tell it what the explosion radius is. And then there's a float upwards modifier, which in this case I'm just going to use 3. Then really that should be it. So let me go ahead here, save that out. Let's make sure that everything is correct. Okay. And then all we have to do is we have to go and find our particle system, our weapon explosion, which has our destroy timer script. And then we're just going to add one more script on it, which is the explosion script. And that'll give it a radius and power. And then if we fire and it explodes near rigid bodies, so then all the explosions near the rigid bodies will cause them to go out of the way. Okay, so that's a basic overview of just kind of setting up a weapon from scratch in Unity, and gives you some ideas of some of the effects and features that you might want for your weapon to get it to work effectively. Now, there's a lot more complicated things that you could do with this. You could set up delays for timers for how long you can have between shots. You could set up more elaborate damage characteristics. You could do things with different types of weapons. You could set up inventories. So I don't want to say that this is like an all-encompassing technique, but it does get you a way that you can set up a first-person weapon using the default assets that Unity comes with without having to do too much extra work. So hopefully that is helpful to you guys. I appreciate it. Also, make sure if you're interested in Unreal Engine that you check out my other video where I cover basically the same kind of steps for making this kind of process work in Unreal Engine. All right, thanks guys. Appreciate you watching.